our last two lessons, we learned about an amazing woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman helped enslaved people in the South find freedom in the North using the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a system of escape from the South to the North. It wasn't actually a railroad, and it wasn't underground. There were conductors, like Harriet Tubman, who led enslaved people from station to station. Stations were places along the way where the conductors and the passengers could rest and get food. The passengers were the enslaved people that were seeking their freedom. One thing that helped with the Underground Railroad was the song "Follow the Drinking Gourd." We talked about this in our last lesson as well. A drinking gourd was a gourd that had been hollowed out and used to scoop up water, like the one shown here. But the drinking gourd in the song was not actually a gourd. It was a group of stars in the sky that was shaped kind of like a drinking gourd. Today, we call this group of stars the Big Dipper. This was used by enslaved people to help them find their way to freedom. They were told to follow the drinking gourd because the drinking gourd pointed the way north. People wanted to escape the South because they had very hard lives and they had no freedom. They wanted to move to the North so that they could be free and live their lives as they wanted. One of the words that we'll need to know for today's read aloud is the word economy. Economy describes the system in which people offer their services or make items to buy, sell, or trade with others who want those items. When people trade, buy, or sell goods with one another, they are cooperating. Because of this cooperation, people can get resources such as food, clothing, and shelter they need that they might otherwise not be able to produce or make for themselves. When more and more people engage in trading, buying, and selling goods, we say that the economy is strong. Harriet Tubman, before she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, worked as a slave on a tobacco plantation in the South. Plantations were an important part of the Southern economy. This is how the people in the South supported themselves and earned money to buy things that they needed. The Southern economy depended on farmers and plantation owners to produce certain crops that other people wanted to buy. To produce these crops, Southern plantation owners treated people from Africa unfairly by forcing them into slavery and making them work on their plantations for no money. Even though it was not their choice, enslaved Africans contributed valuable labor and skills to the success of the plantations. It was wrong of the plantation owners to treat enslaved Africans poorly just because they thought the African people were different from them. The community that developed among enslaved African Americans helped them survive because they relied on and helped each other. Factories. Factories are buildings where goods are made. Agriculture. Agriculture is the science of producing crops, or farming. Abolitionists. Abolitionists were people who worked to abolish or end slavery. The title of today's read aloud is called The Controversy Over Slavery. Controversy means an argument or a disagreement that happens when people have differing opinions. Take a minute to think about what you predict the controversy over slavery was, and who might be involved in that controversy. This controversy over slavery eventually led to a type of war called a civil war. A civil war describes a war between two different groups of people that live within the same country. This particular civil war was called the U.S. Civil War, or the War Between the States. During the time of the Civil War, people had different views of slavery, and many people who believed in slavery tried to justify their opinions of it. but there is no justification for the way these people were mistreated. Slavery was as wrong then as it is wrong today. Let's go back to the year 1850, when Harriet Tubman escaped from a life of slavery in the South by running away to Pennsylvania, a northern state where slavery was not allowed. To divide the North and the South on a map of the United States, it is easiest if you use what is known as the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line is an imaginary line between the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland. It was named after two Englishmen, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, who surveyed this land almost 100 years earlier. The Mason-Dixon line became an imaginary line between the North and the South. Slavery was allowed in the South, below the Mason-Dixon line, but slavery was not allowed in the North, above the Mason-Dixon line. What were the major differences between the states in the North and the states in the South? Slavery was the most obvious difference, but it was not the only difference. The South relied almost completely on agriculture for its economy. Remember, agriculture means farming, and an economy is the system of producing and trading items or services. This means that the economy in the South was based on growing crops and selling them. The farmland and weather provided the right growing conditions for certain crops that grew well in the South, such as cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Most farms in the South were small, with very few enslaved Africans, or even none at all. But there were also enormous plantations, like the one where Harriet Tubman was enslaved, where the plantation owners who grew these crops forced hundreds of enslaved Africans to work day after day under horrible conditions for no wages at all. On these plantations, enslaved Africans worked together, helping each other so their lives would be a little less hard. The crops grown on these plantations were bought by people in the North and as far away as Great Britain, and that helped the Southern economy grow. The North had farms too, but they were different from the large Southern plantations. Some farmers in the North grew corn and wheat, as well as other fruits and vegetables. Some Northern farmers also had livestock, like cattle, sheep, and pigs. But the North did not have the right weather for growing the crops that were grown in the South. Crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco. People in the North could buy these crops from farmers in the South. So farmers in the North grew crops mainly for feeding people and animals, and enslaved Africans were not used on those farms. Unlike the Southern economy, which relied on agriculture, the Northern economy was focused more on industry and manufacturing. That meant workers were paid to make things in factories, often using machines. Remember, a factory is where goods are made in large amounts. Many northern cities were trading centers for iron, coal, and wood. A trading center is where goods are bought and sold. Northern cities had factories for turning iron into steel, a strong metal that would then be sent to other factories to make trains, engines, buildings, bridges, tools, weapons, and all sorts of other things. Northern cities also had factories for making bottles and jars, furniture, clothing, books, and much more. The factories in the North had access to railroads and shipping ports to distribute the goods made there. Because the South wasn't producing a lot of these things in their region, they could buy these goods from the North. People as far away as Great Britain would buy steel from Northern factories, helping the Northern economy. While farming was the most important part of the Southern economy, manufacturing goods to sell was the most important part of the Northern economy. Factories were also an important part of the Northern economy. Thousands and thousands of people worked in Northern factories. These factory workers were not enslaved. They were paid for their hard work. It was true that factory bosses could be harsh, The pay was often pitiful, and the work difficult, dangerous, and tiring. If the pay is pitiful, that means that their wages are very small. They're not making very much money. However, factory workers did have more freedom than slaves, and they had the possibility of a better life. Even though slavery became illegal or against the law in the North before it became illegal in the South, not everyone in the North was against slavery. Because slavery was not a part of their everyday life, some people in the North didn't really think much about it. A small group of people in the North, however, were absolutely against slavery, no matter what it did for the economy. These people saw slavery as evil. They thought people from Africa should be treated as free human beings. These people saw slavery as the cruel and hateful practice that it was. People who worked to abolish or end slavery became known as abolitionists. This group of abolitionists continued to grow larger and larger over time. By the mid-1800s, there were thousands of abolitionists. Some became famous, like Frederick Douglass, who had been an enslaved African who escaped, Wendell Phillips, and Susan B. Anthony. Those three are pictured here, but they were just a few of the thousands of people involved in the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement refers to organized activities or events to end slavery. Harriet Tubman was also a famous abolitionist, in addition to being a famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She not only helped enslaved Africans escape, she also went around talking to people in the North, telling them why it was important to abolish slavery, and explaining what they could do to help enslaved Africans. This image shows abolitionists working on the Underground Railroad. Abolitionists helped keep the Underground Railroad running smoothly, making sure that as many people as possible were able to escape slavery. Harriet Tubman met and worked alongside many famous abolitionists. They printed newspapers with names like The Liberator, and they pressured or convinced political leaders like Abraham Lincoln to see why slavery was wrong. The abolitionist movement became a strong force in America, one that could not be ignored. Abolitionists and enslaved Africans worked together in other ways to rebel against plantation owners and bring an end to slavery. While many enslaved people were being helped to freedom along the Underground Railroad, others were trying to rebel or fight back against plantation owners in the South. One such event took place in Virginia, in the area that is now known as Harper's Ferry. In that event, an abolitionist named John Brown tried to get guns and other weapons to enslaved people to help them rebel against the plantation owners. In another event, an enslaved person named Nat Turner led a group of enslaved people to rebel against plantation owners in Virginia. In South Carolina, another formerly enslaved African named Denmark Vesey helped plan a large rebellion against plantation owners in Charleston. Denmark Vesey's plan was discovered before it could be carried out. However, there were also many small acts of rebellion by enslaved Africans against those who enslaved them. Even in the years leading up to the Civil War, there were many violent events in which many people lost their lives in the struggle to end slavery. The United States was growing, spreading west and adding new states. As the country expanded west, so did the Mason-Dixon line. Remember, this is an imaginary line, it's not an actual line on the ground. By the 1850s, states north of the Mason-Dixon line were free states. In other words, slavery was against the wall. In the states south of the Mason-Dixon line, slavery continued to be legal, and there were more territories to the west that would soon be joining the country. The more the country grew, the more reasons people found to argue over the problem of slavery. As abolitionists fought to end slavery, they also wanted to make sure the new territories and new states did not allow slavery. Others, though, did not agree with the abolitionists. and felt that new states should be able to decide for themselves whether or not slavery would be legal. By the 1850s, it was clear that the problem of what to do about slavery, whether to end it or allow it to continue and to spread, was tearing the country apart.